I sat in the living room with the soft glow of Christmas lights wrapping around the tree, the hum of the old heater filling the quiet. Outside, Springfield was blanketed in snow, the kind that muffles everything and makes the world feel still. I had been glancing at the clock every few minutes, waiting for my son Eric to call. Christmas night was almost over, and I hadn't heard a word from him. I told myself he must be busy with Jessica's family, maybe traveling somewhere nearby, maybe saving the call for later. The phone buzzed on the coffee table. I reached for it quickly, my heart lifting for a moment, but it wasn't a call. It was a text. Jessica's name appeared on the screen. My hands were already cold, but the words seemed to drain whatever warmth I had left. "We're in Barcelona. Only the ones who really matter are here. Merry Christmas." I stared at the message, my eyes reading it over again, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something else, something less cruel. Eric was with her. And Mark, my husband. My own husband. They were halfway across the world together, while I sat here surrounded by the leftovers from Christmas Eve, the smell of the pie I had baked still faint in the kitchen, untouched. I set the phone down, but my hands were trembling. My mind kept tripping over the words, "only the ones who really matter." I felt something between shock and a slow, cold anger begin to settle in my chest. How long had they been planning this? How could Mark have left without saying a word? I thought back to 2 weeks ago when I asked if we should set a time for Christmas dinner. Mark had smiled in that vague way of his and said we would figure it out. Eric had called a few days later, but the conversation was short. I had asked where they might spend the holidays, and he changed the subject. The longer I sat there, the more the details came back. Mark's suitcase had been in the guest room for a few days in mid-December, but he told me he was organizing old files. He had been going out more often, claiming to have coffee with a retired colleague. And Jessica, at Thanksgiving, she had given me that smug little smile when she said some families know how to keep the holidays simple. I got up from the couch and walked to the window. The street was quiet, a few houses still lit up with decorations. I could see Timothy across the road, taking his dog out. He waved, and I managed a faint wave back, forcing my face into something that might pass for normal. Inside, my heart felt like it had dropped into my stomach. I sat back down and picked up the phone again. The time difference hit me. They must be in the middle of dinner now, wine glasses clinking, the air filled with the sounds of a busy restaurant in Spain. I imagined Mark telling a story, Eric laughing, Jessica leaning in, the three of them a neat little circle that had no room for me. I leaned back and closed my eyes. My mind pulled me to the moment last month when I asked Mark directly if we should make any plans for Christmas Eve. He had been sitting at his desk, flipping through the newspaper. Without looking up, he had said we would play it by ear. That phrase felt different now. The phone was still in my hand, and I scrolled up through my messages with Eric. Weeks of small talk, a few unanswered texts from me, the kind that could have led to a real conversation but didn't. I thought about calling him now, asking outright why they had gone without me, but I knew the answer wasn't something I was ready to hear. Not yet. The kitchen clock ticked steadily. I walked in and poured myself a cup of tea, the kettle still warm from earlier. The lights from the living room spilled across the floor, mixing with the glow of the street lamp outside. It should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like standing in someone else's home, like I was a guest in my own life. I sat at the kitchen table and let the steam from the tea fog my glasses. I thought about Christmas mornings when Eric was a boy, tearing through wrapping paper, his cheeks pink from excitement. Mark would sit in the armchair with his coffee, and I would take pictures, always the one to make sure everything looked perfect. We had been a family. I had believed that counted for something. Now, the house felt cavernous, every corner echoing with the absence of people I thought I could rely on. The text lay there in my mind, sharp and bright, the edges cutting deeper each time I turned it over. Only the ones who really matter. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat sink into my skin, trying to hold on to something solid. I didn't know yet what I was going to do, but I knew one thing. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a careless decision. It had been planned, and if it had been planned, Then there were other things I hadn't seen, hadn't been told. The tea had gone cold by the time I stood up. The lights on the tree blinked in a steady rhythm, like nothing had changed. But I knew better. This was not the Christmas I had been waiting for. It was something else entirely, something that was going to demand answers. It had started so quietly, I almost missed it. Back in early October, Jessica had tilted her head at me in the kitchen and said I seemed tired lately. I brushed it off at first, telling her I had just stayed up too late the night before, but she gave me that little sympathetic smile people use when they think they know better. A week later, she told Eric in front of me that maybe I should think about getting one of those medical alert devices, the kind you wear around your neck. I remember laughing it off, but the way she looked at him, not me, stayed with me. Mark began chiming in after that. If I misplaced my reading glasses, he would tell me I was getting forgetful. When I forgot to take a roast out of the oven one Sunday, he made a joke about early senility. They always said it lightly, almost like it was nothing, but the repetition wore on me. Eric called less and less, sometimes going a week without so much as a text. When he did call, Jessica's voice would drift in from the background, steering him toward ending the conversation. One Thursday afternoon in November, I went to the community clubhouse for our monthly book club. The room smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon bread, and the usual crowd had gathered in a half circle of folding chairs. I poured myself a cup and joined the group, but as I set my cup down, I caught my name in a whisper. 2 women from the quilting group were standing near the refreshment table. Their voices dropped when they saw me, but not fast enough. I heard one of them say that it was a shame when someone starts to lose their faculties and doesn't realize it. I sat through the rest of the meeting distracted, nodding at the right times, but hardly hearing a word. The idea that anyone thought I was slipping mentally made my skin prickle. When it was over, I took my time putting on my coat. Timothy, my neighbor from across the street, was waiting near the door. He leaned in slightly and told me I might want to know that certain talk around town was coming from someone close to me. He didn't say more, just looked at me in a way that made me understand. That night, I replayed everything in my head. Jessica's comments, Mark's little jokes, Eric's sudden distance, and now whispers at the clubhouse. It was like a puzzle I didn't want to finish because I knew I wouldn't like the picture. I tried to tell myself it was paranoia, that people talk and stories twist, but there was a pattern, and it pointed in one direction. A week before Thanksgiving, Eric came by to drop off some paperwork for Mark. We were standing in the hallway when I mentioned an old family tradition, how I used to make gingerbread with him when he was a kid. Jessica, who had come in with him, laughed and said that must have been years ago because she didn't think I had baked anything in ages. I reminded her I had baked a pie just the month before for a church fundraiser. She smiled like I had told a joke and glanced at Eric, who shrugged. The holidays used to be my favorite time of year. I would spend weeks planning menus, decorating, wrapping gifts. This year, I felt like I was waiting for an invitation to my own life. Conversations stopped when I walked into the room. They reassured me I was imagining things, but the air between us had changed. One morning in early December, I saw Jessica outside talking to our mail carrier. They laughed, and as she walked back toward her car, she saw me at the window. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. It was the kind of look you give someone you're already finished with, but have to keep around for appearances. That afternoon, Timothy came over under the pretense of returning a casserole dish. As we stood in the doorway, he lowered his voice and said he didn't want to meddle, but thought I should be aware that Jessica had been telling people I was having trouble managing things. He didn't know if it was intentional or just careless, but either way, it was out there. I thanked him, though my stomach twisted. By then, I had started to keep a mental file of every strange comment, every half-truth, every moment where I was subtly pushed aside. I didn't want to believe it, but Timothy's words sealed it. This wasn't accidental. Someone was drawing a picture of me that wasn't true, and they were doing it in places where it would matter later. That night, as the snow began to fall again, I sat at my kitchen table with a pad of paper. I started writing down dates and details. Jessica suggesting the alert device. Mark joking about forgetfulness. Eric cutting calls short, the whisper at the clubhouse, Timothy's warning. Seeing it all in black and white made my chest tighten. This wasn't just me being sensitive. It was deliberate. I looked around my quiet kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I could almost feel the walls closing in, not because of the space, but because of what was happening inside my own family. Whatever they were planning, it was moving forward, and I had been standing still. That was about to change. The next morning, the house was still and cold, the kind of quiet that made every small sound carry. Mark had gone out early, saying something vague about meeting a friend for breakfast. I walked past his office on my way to the laundry room and stopped. The door was cracked open, the smell of his aftershave lingering in the air. I had not been in there for weeks, mostly out of habit. It had always been his space, his desk, his shelves lined with business books and framed photos from company events. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The blinds were half closed, letting in strips of pale winter light across the desk. Papers were stacked neatly, almost too neatly, as if he had just put them in order for someone else to see. On the wall behind the desk hung his large calendar, the kind with wide squares for each day. I moved closer. December looked sparse, with only a few notes penciled in. I ran my finger along the week of Christmas. The square for December 22nd looked smudged, the faint outline of writing still visible under a thin layer of eraser dust. I leaned in until I could make out shapes of letters. It looked like a city name, though I could not be sure. The next 2 days had faint marks too, erased so thoroughly they were almost gone. I felt a small jolt in my chest. Mark never erased things from his calendar. He liked to keep a record, even of old appointments. A draft of cold air brushed my arm, and I turned toward the small wastebasket near the window. It was half full. I bent down and pulled out the top layer of crumpled paper. There were a few bank envelopes, an old grocery list, and under those a wad of thick paper folded in half. I smoothed it out on the desk. The paper was a printed itinerary, the logo of a travel agency in Columbus in the top corner. My eyes moved quickly down the page. Departure from JFK to Barcelona. 3 passengers. The date matched the week before Christmas. The return was scheduled for January 3rd. My hands went cold. I looked for the passenger names, but they were on a separate page. I dug back into the wastebasket and found it. There they were. Mark Harris, Eric Harris, Jessica Harris. My name was nowhere. For a moment, I just stood there holding the paper, the light from the window catching on the glossy ink. I imagined them at the airport together, luggage in tow, smiling for selfies. I pictured Jessica in a window seat, Mark flipping through a travel magazine, Eric leaning back with his headphones on. I wasn't supposed to see any of this. I sat down in Mark's chair, the leather cold against my back. From here, I could see every detail of the room, the little trophies from his accounting days, the framed certificate from when he sold the firm, the photo of us in Charleston 5 years ago. It was strange to look at that picture now. I was smiling, leaning into him, unaware of the years ahead. On the desk was a small notepad with a few scribbled words in his handwriting. I recognized the name of a hotel in Barcelona. Next to it was a check mark. There were also notes for a dinner reservation and what looked like a list of attractions. My stomach turned. This was not a last-minute trip. This had been planned down to the details. I picked up the itinerary again and traced the dates with my finger. They had left the day before Christmas Eve, while I was at home preparing a small dinner, thinking they might come by at the last minute. They had boarded a flight across the ocean, knowing I would be here alone. I placed everything back exactly as I had found it, except for the itinerary, which I folded and slipped into my sweater pocket. My mind was moving too fast for me to sit still. I left the office and closed the door quietly behind me. In the kitchen, I unfolded the paper again on the table. The travel agency's number was printed in bold at the bottom. I almost called, wanting to ask for more details, but stopped myself. I needed to think. If they knew I had found out, they might change whatever else they were planning. I walked to the window and looked out at the yard. The snow was piled high on the fence, the branches bare against the pale sky. Everything looked calm, but inside my chest there was a steady thud, my pulse matching the tightness in my throat. I turned away from the window and poured myself a glass of water, the sound loud in the empty room. My reflection in the microwave door looked older than I remembered. I thought about the whispered conversations, the careful way they had been treating me like someone fragile. It all clicked into place with the itinerary in my pocket. They had been preparing for this for a long time, and I was not part of the picture. I set the glass down on the counter and walked to the phone. My fingers hesitated over the keypad before I pressed the familiar numbers. Robert Miller picked up on the second ring, his voice warm and steady like it had been since we met 20 years ago at a fundraiser. I told him I needed to see him right away, that it was urgent. He did not ask questions, just told me to come by his office at Midwest Trust Bank in the morning. That night, I barely slept. The itinerary lay folded on the nightstand, a silent reminder every time I rolled over. My mind ran through conversations, small moments that now seemed deliberate. By the time the alarm went off, I was already dressed and ready. The bank's lobby was quiet when I walked in, the smell of fresh coffee drifting from a side room. Robert came out from behind the glass doors, his tie slightly askew, his face breaking into a small smile when he saw me. We shook hands and he led me back to his office, closing the door behind us. I sat down across from him, feeling the weight of the folder in my bag. I told him about the trip, about the whispers in town, and then I asked him plainly if Mark had been in to see him recently. Robert's eyes flickered, and he leaned back in his chair. "Yes," he said carefully. "Mark came in a few weeks ago, maybe 3, asking about restructuring some of your accounts. He wanted to know how to add Eric as a joint holder." My chest tightened. "Did he say why?" I asked. Robert nodded slowly. "He said you had been having some memory issues, and that it might be wise to have someone else able to manage things if necessary." The words sat between us for a moment, heavy and sour. Memory issues. The phrase felt like a stone in my stomach. Robert reached for a thick binder on his desk and flipped it open. "I think you should see this," he said, sliding a printed summary toward me. As I scanned the pages, the numbers began to sink in. 72% of our total assets, about $1,350,000, were in my name alone. The house was mine outright, purchased with my inheritance before Mark and I married. My retirement accounts, investment portfolio, and several certificates of deposit were all listed as sole ownership. I traced a line with my finger down the page. Mark could not touch any of this without my signature. He had his own accounts, but they were modest in comparison. I looked up at Robert. "Did he ask about the house?" He nodded. He wanted to know if there was a way to transfer it quietly. I told him no, not without your involvement, and even then it would be a lengthy process. I leaned back, the chair creaking beneath me. The room felt both too warm and too cold at the same time. The facts were here in black and white. Mark had been laying groundwork for something bigger than a holiday trip. Robert folded his hands. "I do not know what his intentions are, but from what you are telling me, I think you need to take precautions." I took a slow breath, closed the joint accounts, moved the funds into my name only, changed the online passwords. He nodded once. "We can do all of that today." For the next hour, I signed forms, my pen scratching across the paper in deliberate strokes. We moved money, updated beneficiaries, and created new account numbers. Robert assured me the changes would take effect immediately. When it was done, I sat there for a moment, looking at the neat stack of paperwork. The knot in my chest had loosened, replaced by something else. Not relief, not yet, but a sense of control I had not felt in months. Robert walked me to the door. "Call me if anything else comes up," he said. "I will keep an eye on things from my end." Outside, the cold air hit my face, sharp and bracing. I tucked the folder under my arm and headed to my car. The engine turned over with a low hum, and as I pulled out of the parking lot, I knew this was only the beginning. There was more to uncover, and I was ready to find it. The next morning, I was back in Robert's office before the bank had even opened to the public. The lobby was still dim, the only sound the faint hum of the heating system. He greeted me with a quiet nod and ushered me into the same leather chair I had sat in the day before. We got to work immediately. I told him I wanted every joint account closed, every dollar moved into accounts under my name only. No exceptions. Robert tapped at his keyboard, printing out forms and setting them in front of me in neat stacks. I signed each one, my hand steady. Next came the online accounts. Robert had me create new usernames and long, complicated passwords for each bank login, every investment account, even the credit cards. I wrote them down in my own notebook, not on any bank forms, and slipped it into my purse. It felt strange to think that the people I had trusted most were exactly the ones I now needed to keep out. We went through the credit cards one by one. I closed the ones we shared and applied for new ones in my name. Robert suggested I keep one small joint account with a minimal balance for any bills that still came under both our names. I agreed, but insisted the balance never go above a few $100s. When that was finished, Robert reached for a folder he had prepared. "I thought you might want to see a complete printout of all activity for the past 6 months," he said. "It could give you a clearer picture." I opened the folder and began flipping through the pages. The columns of numbers blurred at first until one entry caught my eye. It was dated 6 months ago, labeled as a family gift in the amount of $25,000. The recipient's name was listed as Eric Harris. My pulse quickened. I scanned the notes attached to the transaction. There was my signature, the neat cursive I had learned in high school, right under a line authorizing the transfer. I had no memory of signing this. Robert leaned over slightly. "That was processed along with a few other documents on the same day. I believe Mark brought them in for you both to sign." I remembered vaguely that afternoon. Mark had handed me a small stack of papers, telling me they were updates to our will. I had been distracted, probably thinking about dinner or the laundry. I had signed without reading every page. I turned back to the printout. $25,000, enough for the down payment on that shiny SUV Eric and Jessica had been so proud to show off last summer. I could see it now in my mind, parked in their driveway, still smelling like new leather. Jessica had smiled and said they had found a great deal. I had congratulated them. I had even brought over a pie to celebrate. My stomach twisted. This was my money. Money I had saved and invested for decades. And they had taken it without even telling me what I was signing. Robert watched my face. "Do you want me to flag that transaction for possible dispute?" "Not yet," I said quietly. "But make a copy of every page and put them in a separate envelope for me." He nodded and began printing while I sat there, the hum of the printer filling the silence. I felt something harden inside me. This was not just about being left behind for Christmas. This was about them slowly erasing me from my own life while helping themselves to what I had built. When Robert handed me the envelope, it felt heavier than it should have. I thanked him and stood, tucking it into my bag. The changes we had made were already in motion. By the end of the day, Mark and Eric would find that the accounts they had counted on were either gone or locked tight. Walking back to my car, I could feel the cold air bite at my cheeks. It was sharp and clean, like the first deep breath after being underwater too long. I started the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands on the wheel, the envelope beside me on the seat. The SUV's image came back to me again, gleaming in the sun, and I knew I was far from finished. That afternoon, I called Timothy and asked if he had a few minutes to talk. He came over with his jacket zipped up to his chin, stomping the snow from his boots before stepping into my foyer. We stood in the kitchen with steaming mugs of coffee as I told him I needed to find out something about Eric's house without alerting anyone in the family. Timothy nodded slowly and said he might know someone who could help. His cousin worked in the mortgage department at a regional bank downtown. If I wanted, he could reach out quietly and see what he could learn. I agreed, feeling a flicker of both relief and unease. He pulled out his phone and stepped into the hallway to make the call. I listened to his low voice, the occasional pause as he waited for answers. When he came back, he had that cautious look people get when they are about to share something unpleasant. He says the mortgage is past due. 45 days, he told me. I felt the heat rise in my chest. 45 days meant they were already into late payment penalties, maybe even fielding calls from the bank. A part of me ached, picturing Eric juggling bills, maybe feeling trapped. But another part of me remembered the SUV, the $25,000, the trip to Spain. They had money for those things, but not for the roof over their heads. "Did he say anything else?" I asked. "Just that it was still in their names only." Timothy said, "No sign of anyone else involved." He asked if you were thinking of stepping in. I shook my head. Not yet. After Timothy left, I sat at the dining room table with a legal pad in front of me. I wrote down the details. 45 days past due, penalties accruing, still in their names. I circled the words leverage and timing. This was information worth holding on to, not to fix their problem for them, but to remind them later exactly who had the ability to pull them out of it. The next morning, I drove past their house on the way to the grocery store. The SUV sat in the driveway, a thin crust of snow along the hood. Christmas lights were strung haphazardly across the porch, a few bulbs dark. The curtains were drawn. I wondered if they were even home, or if the house was just sitting there while they wandered through Spanish markets and tourist spots. At the store, I picked up only the basics, avoiding the holiday displays near the front. The sight of families shopping together, laughing over which cookies to bake, tightened something in my chest. I kept thinking about that mortgage notice, probably sitting unopened on their kitchen counter. Back at home, I tucked the groceries away and pulled the envelope from Robert out of my purse. I went through the statements again, this time looking for any sign that they had been moving money around in anticipation of the trip. Several charges caught my eye, including airline purchases weeks before the travel dates and hotel deposits. All of it came from accounts I had just closed or moved. They would be discovering that soon enough. In the late afternoon, the sun dipped behind the bare trees, casting long shadows across the yard. I sat in the living room with the folder on my lap and realized I felt calmer than I had in days. Knowing the state of their finances gave me something concrete. It was no longer just a vague sense of being cut out. I could see the lines connecting their choices to the situation they were in. I decided to keep the mortgage information to myself for now. Let them come home expecting help, assuming I would fix things like I always had. When the moment came, I would decide if they deserved it. Until then, it would stay right here with me, one more piece of the puzzle they never thought I would see. The phone rang just after noon, the caller ID showing Mark's number. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice came through tense, the background filled with muffled voices and clinking dishes. He said they were in Seville, and the hotel clerk was telling him the payment would not go through. He asked if there was a problem with the card. I told him calmly that the accounts he was trying to use were in my name and I had made changes. Money that belongs to me is under my control. There was a pause on the line. Then he started to say something about an emergency and how they were traveling with limited cash. I reminded him that they had managed to plan an entire overseas trip without my involvement, so I was confident they could figure this out as well. Jessica's voice cut in suddenly, sharper than his. She said this was ridiculous, that she did not know what I was talking about. I brought up the $25,000 sent to Eric, the one with my signature on it, the money that bought their new SUV. She denied it immediately, claiming I must have misunderstood and that it was probably something Mark had handled. I told her plainly that I expected repayment in full within 30 days. If not, I would take legal action. There was a rush of static as she snapped back that I was overreacting, that family did not threaten each other like that. I said family also did not drain accounts and lie about it. Mark came back on the line, his voice low, trying to smooth things over. He said maybe we could talk when they returned, maybe arrange some kind of compromise. I told him there was nothing to compromise. The money was mine, and I had every right to decide what happened to it. Jessica's voice rose in the background, sharp and clipped, asking if I was seriously leaving them stranded. I heard the sound of her saying something to Eric, though I could not make out the words. Mark tried again, saying they could not even check out of the hotel without payment. I said I hoped they enjoyed the rest of their trip and hung up. The silence in the house after the call ended felt almost solid. I sat back in my chair, staring out at the snow falling in slow, heavy flakes, knowing they were thousands of miles away with fewer options than they had the day before. 2 days later, I drove into town to meet Susan Grant for coffee. We had gone to college together and stayed in touch over the years, though lately our meetings were fewer and farther between. When she saw me walk into the cafe, she waved from a corner table near the window. The smell of cinnamon rolls and fresh coffee wrapped around me as I sat down. She asked how my Christmas had been, and something in her voice told me she already suspected it had not been good. I told her everything, from the whispers in the clubhouse to finding the travel itinerary, the closed accounts, the $25,000, and finally the call from Seville. I did not rush. I wanted her to hear every detail, to understand it was not one bad decision, but a deliberate pattern. Susan leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. "You cannot keep this to yourself," she said. "People already have bits and pieces, and without the truth, they will fill in the blanks with whatever Jessica feeds them." She suggested that the next time I was at the town clubhouse, I tell the story as plainly as I had told her. No embellishments, no shouting, just the truth. I hesitated at first, thinking about the fallout. But the more we talked, the more it made sense. The whispers had been used against me. Maybe it was time they worked in my favor. That Friday, I went to the book club meeting. The room was crowded, women in sweaters, clustered around the coffee table. I waited until the discussion was over, then stood and said, there was something I needed to share. My voice was steady. I told them how my husband and my son's wife had gone to Spain for Christmas without me, how they had used my money without my consent, and how they had been telling people I was losing my memory. The room was silent for a moment, then a ripple of voices spread. Some women shook their heads, others leaned in to hear more. I answered a few questions, making sure to stick to the facts. When I left, I could feel eyes following me, the weight of the story already moving beyond those walls. By Saturday afternoon, the calls began. Friends from church, a neighbor from 2 streets over. People had heard, and they were angry for me. They offered words of support, some even offering to help if I needed anything. I thanked them, but kept my answers short. I did not want to sound like I was recruiting allies, though in truth, that is exactly what was happening. That evening, my phone lit up with Jessica's number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, she called again. I answered this time, and her voice came through tight and sharp. She accused me of trying to ruin their reputation, of spreading lies in town. She said Eric was humiliated and that people were starting to treat them differently online and in person. I told her the same thing I had told the women at the clubhouse. Every word I spoke was true, and if their reputation was damaged, it was not because of me. There was a long pause, and I could almost hear her grinding her teeth. That reputation is not something I created, I said. If it is in pieces now, you should think about why. She tried to fire back, but I ended the call before she could finish. The quiet that followed felt different this time, not heavy like before, but lighter, edged with a sense of control I had not felt in a long while. 3 days later, I heard the crunch of tires on the driveway. Through the kitchen window, I saw Mark's sedan pull in, Eric's SUV right behind it. All 3 of them stepped out, their faces set in expressions that tried to look calm but carried an edge of urgency. I stayed where I was, at the kitchen table, the folder of documents spread neatly in front of me. They came in without knocking. Mark headed straight for the kitchen, Jessica close behind, Eric lingering in the doorway. I gestured to the chairs. None of them sat. I slid the first stack forward, copies of the updated will and the property deeds. Mark's eyes moved over the papers, then back to me. I told them I had made changes, all perfectly legal, and that every significant asset in my name was now secured against any transfer without my explicit consent. Eric shifted, glancing toward Jessica, who kept her arms crossed. I pulled out the next set, bank statements, and the transaction for $25,000. I pointed to the page with Eric's name and my signature. His mouth opened, then closed. He muttered something about not knowing the details, that Jessica handled most of it. Jessica's tone was quick and defensive. She said it was a misunderstanding, that the money had been meant as a family expense and they had assumed I was fine with it. I reached for the photocopy of the receipt showing the deposit into Eric's account, along with the paperwork for the SUV purchase the very next week. Eric started to speak again, but I slid the final sheet across the table. It was the bank record of the mortgage, 45 days past due. I told them I knew exactly how far behind they were, and that it explained a lot about why they might have counted on extra holiday money. The kitchen was silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Mark cleared his throat, as if trying to take control, but the weight in the room had shifted. It was not his voice or Jessica's or Eric's that carried authority here. It was mine. I leaned back, letting the quiet do the work. No one moved. Eric's eyes dropped to the papers, Jessica's jaw tightened, and Mark looked between us, calculating but saying nothing. We all knew where the power sat now, and it was not leaving my hands. I picked up the top page of the stack and tapped it lightly against the table. Eric, you have 30 days to return the $25,000. I do not care how you do it, but it will be in my account by then. His head jerked up, eyes wide, but he said nothing. I turned to Mark. You have 1 week to decide if you want to start marriage counseling or file for divorce. There is no middle ground anymore. His mouth tightened, but he stayed silent, his gaze fixed on the edge of the table. Finally, I looked at Jessica. From this moment on, you will not receive 1 cent from me. No direct gifts, no help with bills, nothing that even resembles financial support. Her face flushed red almost instantly. She slammed her hand on the table, the sound echoing in the kitchen. This is insane, she shouted. You cannot just cut me off like that. I kept my voice level. I can, and I have. She began talking over me, throwing out words like ungrateful, manipulative, cruel. I let her go on until her voice wavered, then said calmly that my generosity had been taken for granted for too long. That ended today. Eric shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting between his wife and me. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but when he caught my expression, he closed it again. Mark's silence was louder than anything Jessica could say. He did not rush to defend her, did not offer excuses, did not even look at me for approval. He simply sat there, shoulders slightly hunched, staring at the table. It was the first time in years I had seen him not take her side in an argument with me. Jessica seemed to notice too. Her voice rose again, demanding that Mark say something, that he stop me from humiliating her. He stayed quiet, his jaw set, hands folded tightly together. I pushed the folder toward the center of the table, letting the pages fan out just enough for them to see the evidence again. These are not threats, I said. These are terms. The choice of how to respond is yours. No one replied. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the house settling in the winter cold. I stood, walked to the sink, and poured myself a glass of water, feeling the tension in the room hang like heavy curtains around us. 30 days passed without a single payment from Eric. I marked each week on the calendar, giving him every opportunity to do the right thing. When the deadline came and went, I called Patricia Carter, my attorney, and explained the situation. She listened without interrupting, then told me she would draft a formal demand letter for immediate payment and have it sent by certified mail. She promised the letter would make it clear that if the money was not returned, we would proceed with legal action. 2 days later, Patricia called to tell me the letter had been delivered. Eric had signed for it himself. I could imagine his face when he saw the return address from her firm. He did not call me. Jessica did, her voice tight with anger, telling me I was blowing things out of proportion. I let her finish, then said she could take it up with Patricia. By mid-February, I began hearing whispers from mutual acquaintances. Jessica had lost a major contract with one of her longtime clients. The reason, they said, was that word had gotten around about how she and Eric had treated me. No one wanted to be associated with that kind of story. I had not set out to sabotage her work, but I was not going to apologize for people knowing the truth. Mark was not spared either. Friends he had known for decades stopped inviting him to golf outings and dinners. Couples we had spent holidays with turned down his calls. The country club, which had once been a second home for him, seemed to have quietly moved him off every guest list. I never asked for details. I just noticed the growing number of evenings he spent at home alone. One morning in early March, I stood at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee, looking out at the melting snow and the bare trees. For the first time in months, I felt no rush of anger when I thought about them. I felt distance, like their choices and their consequences were playing out in another life that no longer involved me. That afternoon, I went online and booked a ticket to Florence, Italy. I found one-bedroom apartment owned by a woman named Elena Rossi, just off a quiet street near the Arno River. It was available for a full month starting in April. I paid the deposit without hesitation. When I arrived, Florence wrapped itself around me like a warm scarf. Elena greeted me with fresh bread and a list of her favorite markets. I spent mornings wandering cobblestone streets, afternoons sitting at small cafes, and evenings in Elena's kitchen learning to make pasta from scratch. I met neighbors who invited me to their Sunday dinners, people who knew nothing about my past and wanted nothing from me except my company. Each day felt lighter than the one before, and with every step through that sunlit city, I understood more clearly that I had taken back my life. One quiet afternoon, the bells from a nearby church drifted through the open window while I sipped espresso at the small table in Elena's kitchen. My phone lit up with a number I knew by heart. For a moment, I considered letting it ring, but curiosity won. Eric's voice was softer than I remembered, almost hesitant. He said he had been thinking a lot and that he was sorry for how things had unfolded. He admitted the choices they made had been wrong, that they had hurt me, and that he wanted a chance to repair the relationship. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him I was willing to meet when I returned, but I would not go back to the way things used to be. I said I was living for myself now, and if he wanted to remain in my life, he would have to prove it through his actions, not just his words. He was quiet for a long moment, then said he understood. I ended the call with no promises, only the truth. 2 weeks later, I returned to Springfield. The house felt different when I unlocked the door, as if it had been waiting for me to claim it again. I spent days clearing out rooms, donating clothes and furniture, rearranging spaces so they reflected who I was now. The kitchen table, where so many tense conversations had taken place, became a place for morning coffee with friends. I joined the local art club, something I had always wanted to do but never made time for. I attended community events, tried a new yoga class, and began hosting small dinners for neighbors who brought laughter back into my home. I heard from Eric occasionally, short calls and messages that were polite but cautious, as if he understood that trust would take time. One evening in early summer, I sat on the porch watching fireflies flicker over the lawn. The air was warm and still, and I felt a sense of peace I had not known in years. My life was no longer defined by what others took from me, but by what I chose to give myself. If you have ever been in a place where your silence felt like surrender, remember that silence can also be power. I would love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments. And if this story has resonated with you, consider subscribing so you can join me for more stories about the strength we find when we choose ourselves.